Assalamu alaikum, dear students. Welcome to the course Principle in Animal Life 2. This is lecture number 34. The topic is Early Development of Darwin's Ideas of Evolution. This lecture is divided into two videos, and this is the first video of lecture number 34. Discussing agenda for the lecture is Descent with Modification by Natural Selection, Darwin's Research, The Voyage of the Beagle, Darwin's Focus on Adaptation. Lecture outcome. After watching and listening this lecture, students will know about the early development of Darwin's ideas of evolution. In this lecture, we will study the various observations of Darwin which enabled him to formulate the theory of evolution by natural selection. Descent with modification by natural selection. You are already aware of this term, descent with modification. In 1859, Darwin formulated his findings into a manuscript. In that book, he used the word evolution only once, and that too was on the very last paragraph of that book. He used the phrase descent with modification for the change observed in the species. And natural selection means that organisms which have traits that are favorable to the prevailing environmental conditions will have greater opportunities of survival and reproduction and will leave more offsprings as compared to organisms which have less beneficial traits. So, descent with modification by natural selection explains the adaptation of organisms and the unity and diversity of life. We can also say that the theory of evolution by natural selection, this theory explains why the organisms are so perfectly adapted to the environment where they live, why the organisms have similarities between them, certain characters are common between organisms, and why there is so much diversity in the living kingdom. So these are basically the three questions which we put forth in the very first lecture of chapter 5, and this is the theory which provide answer to these three questions. At the start of the 19th century, it was generally thought that species had remained unchanged since their creation. Darwin was born in 1809, and before the birth of Darwin, Aristotle was an influential philosopher, and his concept, his ideas influenced the Western thinking, the Western mindset. Aristotle believed in special creation. He believed that the God's creation is perfect, and it was also according to the biblical teachings that the God's creation is perfect and the species are not changing, the species are fixed. So there was no idea of evolution, there was no concept of evolution at that time, and any person who had such ideas was thought to had ideas that were contradictory to the religious teachings. Therefore, people were afraid to express such type of opinions at that time, which were contradictory to the religious teachings. A few clouds of doubt about the permanence of species were beginning to gather. Means with the passage of time, some people thought that the species are not permanent, they are plastic, they change with the passage of time. These ideas were slowly and gradually gathering, but nobody was aware that after some time someone will suddenly come upon a scene and will say something that will completely change the face of biology, and that will open up a new field, a new era of biology, that is evolutionary biology. Someone will come and someone will brought a revolution into that field, and that person eventually was Charles Darwin. Now, how Charles Darwin himself was able to bring about such a revolution? Charles Darwin was born in Shrewsbury in Western England. He was a boy, means in his very early age he was interested in nature. He used to read books on nature, collected insects, and he was fond of fishing, riding, hunting. His father was a physician, and he was not in favor of his son being a naturalist. He also wanted his son to become a physician too. Therefore, he sent his son to a medical school. But at that time, the patients were operated, the surgeries were done without giving anesthesia to the patients. Obviously, it was a practice which was very painful for the patients, and Darwin was not someone who could see the patients in such pain, such horrifying situation. So he denied this choice of his father, and he started looking forward to become a clergyman, to become a priest, and he got himself enrolled in Cambridge University. At Cambridge University, Darwin became the student, the pupil of John Henslow, a botany professor. Soon after graduation, Henslow, the professor of Darwin, recommended Darwin to Captain Robert Fitzroy, who was preparing the survey ship HMS Beagle for a long voyage around the world. There was a project of preparing a map of some of the regions around the world, and it was a 5 years project. A ship had to sail for 5 years around the world, and that ship was under the captainship of Robert Fitzroy. So the professor of Darwin recommended Darwin as one of the companions of Captain Robert Fitzroy for that journey. Darwin would pay his own way and serve as a conversation partner to the young captain. Fitzroy, who was himself an accomplished scientist, accepted Darwin because he was a skilled naturalist and because they were of similar age and social class. So the recommendation of Professor Henslow was accepted by Captain Robert Fitzroy, and he was willing to accompany Darwin on his HMS Beagle. The voyage of the Beagle. So this ship started its journey in December 1831. The primary mission of the voyage was to chart poorly known stretches of the South American coastline, means to prepare a map of the coastal areas of South American continent. Darwin had ample time, he had a lot of time which he used for observing and collecting thousands of plants and animals. Means apart from his responsibilities, his duties, he also had time to observe the plants and animals in that area, and also to make some collections of the fossils and the living ones. He described features of organisms that made them well suited to such diverse environments. So the ship visited areas which had diverse environments, such like the humid jungles of Brazil, the expansive grasslands of Argentina, and the towering peaks of the Andes. Andes is a mountain range in South America. So these are three diverse areas, and because of their diversity, they will obviously have diverse flora and fauna, which is suitable to thriving in these areas. And in order to thrive in these diverse areas, they will definitely have these area specific or environment specific adaptations. So Darwin studied these adaptations which enabled them to thrive in these diverse areas. He also noted that the plants and animals in temperate regions of South America more closely resembled species living in the South America tropics than species living in temperate regions of Europe. Now first he studied the adaptations which enabled these living organisms, these animals and plants to thrive in the areas where they were found. Secondly, he also started to establish the relationship between the living forms that were present there. This is the map which shows the journey undertaken by the HMS Beagle. You can see here the South American continent, where Argentina, this is the mainland. This is the most important point, the Galapagos Island, where Darwin spent some time, and most of his findings which helped Darwin to formulate his theory of evolution came while his stay on this particular group of islands, the Galapagos Islands. So his stay on this group of islands was the most important one. Voyage of the Beagle. Furthermore, the fossil he found, though clearly different from living species, distinctly resembled the living organisms of South America. Means the fossils which he found there resemble the ones, the living species that lived on the South American continent. They had a relationship with each other. Darwin also spent much time thinking about geology. Despite repeated bouts of seasickness, he read Lyell's Principle of Geology during the voyage. He experienced geologic change firsthand when a violent earthquake shook the coast of Chile. Means during his stay he also experienced earthquake, and he observed afterwards that rocks along the coast had been thrust upward by several meters because of that earthquake. Finding fossils of ocean organisms high in the Andes. Andes, remember, it is a mountain range, and it is the longest continental mountain range in the world. Now Darwin found fossils in these mountain ranges, and what Darwin concluded, Darwin inferred that the rocks containing the fossils must have been raised there by many similar earthquakes. Now recall from the last slide that Darwin during his journey experienced an earthquake, and after the earthquake some of the rocks were thrust upward by several meters, and when he observed the rocks of the Andes mountains, so he established in relationship between what he experienced to what might have happened in the past, and thought that the Andes mountain may also have arose in a similar way, and therefore they have the fossils of the sea animals, although nowadays they are at a much higher level than the sea, but they are having the fossils of the sea animals. So we can assume that once upon a time in the past their level was below that of the sea. These observations reinforced what he had learned from Lyell. So Charles Lyell once said that there are forces which are in action, and these forces are slowly and gradually transforming the shape of the earth, and these forces are slow. These forces are taking place, and the transformation are taking place slowly and gradually over thousands of years. So it gave idea to Darwin that if these forces are operating so slowly and these changes are taking place so slowly, so it means that the age of the earth is not just 6,000 years old, but it is a lot much older than that. Darwin's interest in the species or fossils found in an area was further stimulated by the Beagle stop at the Galapagos, a group of volcanic islands located near the equator about 900 kilometers west of South America. This is the Galapagos Island, as already discussed, that the Darwin's time, the Darwin's findings, the Darwin's observations in this island, on this island, played a major role towards the development of his idea of evolution. He spent there few days, but these few days were having a major impact on his theory. Darwin was fascinated by the unusual organisms there. There means on Galapagos Island. The birds he collected included several kinds of mockingbirds. These mockingbirds, though similar to each other, seem to be different species. Means these birds do had similarities with each other, but they were different species from each other. Some were unique to individual islands. As already stated, that Galapagos was not a single island, it was a group of islands, and the bird species which were present on those different islands do had similarities with each other as well as differences. Furthermore, although the animals on the Galapagos resembled species living on the South American mainland, most of the Galapagos species were not known from anywhere else in the world. Darwin hypothesized that the Galapagos had been colonized by organisms that had strayed from South America and then diversified, giving rise to new species on the various islands. So, as already discussed in the map, that this suppose this is the South American region, and this is the Galapagos Island. It is a group of islands, several islands, and it is 900 kilometers away from the mainland. 900 kilometers away. So what Darwin observed, that these group of islands had different species which had similarities with each other, and the species which were found on these small islands had similarities with the species found on the mainland, on the South American mainland. So the species found here had similarities between them as well as similarities with the ones found on the South American mainland. And the second point is that those two species had no similarities with other ones elsewhere in the world. So what Darwin concluded, that these species, their ancestors must have migrated from this mainland. Means their ancestors used to live on this South American mainland, and then they migrated to these Galapagos Island, and these 14 species of finches which have differences in their beak structure. Their beak is modified, and because of this modification their feeding habits uh, have changed, means the originally it was one ancestral species, but this ancestral species then spread to different areas where it found different items to eat, and the beak structure was adopted in the same way. At some points, insects were available for feeding. At others, worms were available. At still other points, nectar was available. So the beak was modified accordingly, and all those 14 species evolved from a single ancestral stock which migrated from the South American mainland. Darwin's focus on adaptation. You can see here the structure of the beak is different. These are the cactus eaters, these are the insect eaters, and these are the seed eaters. During the voyage of the Beagle, Darwin observed many examples of adaptation. Adaptation means inherited characteristics of organisms that enhance their survival and reproduction in specific environments. So these are the inherited characteristics, and this characteristic is enhancing the ability of that bird to survive and reproduce in that specific environment. So we can assume that this particular beak structure is suitable to the type of the food available in that environment. This particular beak structure is suitable to the food on offer in that environment. Similar is the case here. He began to perceive adaptation to the environment and the origin of new species as closely related processes. So now he started thinking that this struggle to adapt to a particular environment is also a way where new species arises. Could a new species arise from an ancestral form by the gradual accumulation of adaptations to a different environment? Yes. From studies made years after Darwin's voyage, biologists have concluded that this is indeed what happened to a diverse group of finches found on the Galapagos island. So when an organism suddenly finds a new environment, then there is always a struggle for survival. Every organism wants to survive. Every organism wants to transfer its genes, wants to reproduce before dying, and in order to achieve this goal, the organism tries to find ways and means to survive in a particular environment, and in this way the organism modify itself with the passage of time, and so when the modifications occur and the modifications are successful and the organism becomes adopted, then we say that the evolution has occurred. So Darwin realized that explaining such adaptations was essential to understanding evolution. His explanation of how adaptation arises centered on natural selection Natural selection is a process in which individuals that have certain inherited traits tends to survive and reproduce at higher rates than do other individuals because of those traits, means organisms which have traits that enables them to thrive well under the prevailing environmental conditions have greater opportunities of transferring their genes as compared to organisms who have less favorable traits. So by the early 1840s, Darwin had worked out the major features of his hypothesis. He set these ideas on paper in 1844 when he wrote a long essay on descent with modification and its underlying mechanism, natural selection. So by the end of 1844, Darwin was in a position where he could have clearly stated that the process of evolution do takes place. The species do change with the passage of time, and what is the driving force for that change, why the species change. The species change because of the change in the environment. As the environment changes, the species also tries to adapt themselves according to that change, and because of those new adaptations, they change from their ancestral stock and evolve into new species. Yet he was still reluctant to publish his ideas, in part because he anticipated the uproar they would cause. Now, they say that in 1844 he had already formulated his findings, he had already formulated the concept, the phenomena that evolution do takes place and the mechanism is natural selection, but he was reluctant to publish his findings because he already knew that my findings is something which is against the Old Testament, the biblical teachings, and how the community or the people will accept my findings because they are contrary to our religious teachings. So he was reluctant to publish them. By the mid 1850s, he had described his ideas to Lyell and a few others. Lyell, who was not yet convinced of evolution, nevertheless urged Darwin to publish on the subject before someone else came to the same conclusion and publish first. So Charles Lyell was initially not convinced by the process of evolution or the concept of evolution, but he still forced or convinced Darwin that you must publish your findings before someone else publishes it, and then all your efforts will go in vain. Someone else will cash in the opportunity, so you must report your findings as soon as possible. In June 1858, Lyell's prediction came true. Darwin received a manuscript from Alfred Russel Wallace, a British naturalist working in South Pacific island of the Malaya archipelago. He was a famous naturalist too, and he also arrived at a similar conclusion, and unfortunately he sent his manuscript, his unpublished manuscript, to Darwin for a review, and the Darwin got a lot of ideas from his manuscript, and the Darwin didn't wait too long after reviewing his manuscript and published his own. Wallace had developed a hypothesis of natural selection nearly identical to Darwin's. He asked Darwin to evaluate his paper and forward it to Lyell if it merited publication. Darwin compiled, writing to Lyell, "Your words have come true with a vengeance. I never saw a more striking coincidence. So all my originality, whatever it may amount to, will be smashed." Means the Alfred Wallace had compiled similar kinds of ideas or observations that was compiled by Charles Darwin. On July 1, 1958, Lyell and a colleague presented Wallace's paper along with extracts from Darwin's unpublished 1844 essay to the Linnean Society of London. Darwin quickly finished his book titled On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, commonly referred to as The Origin of Species, and published it the next year. Although Wallace has submitted his ideas for publication first, he admired Darwin and thought that Darwin had developed and tested the idea of natural selection so extensively that he should be known as its main architect. Now, both of them worked independently, both of them compiled similar conclusions. Sometimes the people do argue that the Alfred Wallace didn't receive the credit he was due for, and Darwin somewhat hijacked the ideas of Alfred Wallace, and but here they have reported that it was Wallace who himself accepted the fact that it was Darwin who deserved more reward for his ideas. Within a decade, Darwin's book and its proponents had convinced most scientists of the time that life's diversity is the product of evolution. Darwin succeeded where previous evolutionists had failed, mainly by presenting a plausible scientific mechanism with immaculate logic and an avalanche of supporting evidence. Means the idea or the theory he presented was backed by evidence, which we will discuss in the second part of this lecture. Thank you.